Hello, everybody. My name is Sam Weeks. I am a full-time admissions consultant, and I am also the founder of Sam Weeks Consulting. And today I'm joined by Zack Hoyt, one of our senior admissions consultants here at Sam Weeks Consulting. Zack is in an unusual, in a unique position, or in an enviable position to be an HBS graduate. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to dive into Zack's experience at HBS. We're going to talk about how that experience is reflected in his MBA consulting work, and then ultimately how that can benefit you as an applicant. So let's dive in. Zack, introduce yourself.
Thanks very much, Sam. I really appreciate it. So really happy to be here today and chatting with you about my experience at HBS and beyond with Sam Weeks Consulting. My background is similar to a lot of HBS graduates in that I was in the military before. We have a fair contingent of the class that are military veterans. I started off my career at Vanderbilt University, where I studied economics. I had a 3.5 GPA. I was an ROTC scholar there. So immediately after university, I went into the Navy. I was a Navy officer across 3 tours, and transitioned out of the military in 2018 when they were going to send me back to sea for 3 years, and I thought I think I'd rather stay on land. So ultimately decided that business school was going to be the career pivot for me from the military to the private sector, and happy to jump into how that all went down and what the process looked like and anything you want to talk about.
Yeah, awesome. So you're applying to business schools at that point. Can you talk about what your profile looked like at the point of application? So things like GPA and GMAT, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So GPA, as I mentioned, 3.5 economics major from Vanderbilt, which is a pretty well-regarded school in the States. My GRE, I took the GRE only. I got a 329, and I think it was a bit stronger on the verbal than the quant, but not too big of a differential. I had been working at the Pentagon for several years directly for the Chief of Naval Operations, which is like the head of the Navy at the Pentagon. And so, though a lot of times military applicants are evaluated in a similar way, I think that experience working directly for the head of the Navy at the Pentagon kind of has a little bit of a ooh-ah factor, in separating me from other military candidates. I'd also spent a lot of time on nonprofit work with veteran suicide prevention nonprofit that I was really passionate about in DC. So had a little bit of the professional and the nonprofit angle, as well as the military and the academic background. So pretty well rounded, I'd say. But ultimately, you never know if it's going to be enough to get into HBS.
Yeah, for sure. And so given that you had quite a lot of diverse experience there, can you talk about what you lent on in your essay?
Yeah, certainly. So I decided to go with the hyper vulnerable essay. I think there's a lot of different flavors, and when we talk with our clients, we talk about these kind of different buckets of essays, whether it's a personal experience that was very profound for you in shaping who you are today, or of a personal experience that you want to share that really reveals a vulnerable side that's going to allow you to connect with the admissions committee member who's reading this, or something about a professional achievement. I went the hyper vulnerable route, and I told a story that was really a powerful experience for me. I talked about, because I had been working on these veteran suicide nonprofit issues for a while in DC, I talked about the genesis of that work, which was one of my close friends on the ship that I was on my first tour, who unfortunately took his own life, and how that left me despondent because of the impact on not just me, but the other crew members, other officers on the ship, but that it incited me to take action and to actually figure out what we can do as community members to stop this scourge of veteran suicide. And it had gotten really bad and was getting a lot of attention because of just the prevalence of veterans unfortunately taking their own lives. So that was what I wrote my essay about, was what happened, how it affected me, and how it incited me to action, and then ultimately how that is illustrative of me as a person, and why that makes me want to take my next step as going to HBS to drive action and impact in the world more broadly.
So I think it's fair to say that an extracurricular activity that really, really meant something to you
Yeah.
is quite sort of what's standing out there. This is not some extracurricular that you've done as a box ticking exercise or as a way to fill time or anything like that. This is a really, really strong extracurricular that really feeds into what matters to you.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction to make, because we see that a lot with clients. Is everyone wants to have as well-rounded of an application as possible, and if you go on a week-long trip to Nicaragua when you were in high school to help build a house, like, that's wonderful. It's great that you did that, but should 15 years later you lean on that as the formative experience of your essay? Like, unless you did a lot relevant between that trip and your application, it can be fairly transparent if you try to lean on like little nonprofit efforts that look good, but when you dig really deep into them, if you're not spending a lot of time on them, and they're not really authentically important to you, I think that comes across pretty clearly. So just a general piece of guidance there, if I could.
It's difficult to be hyper vulnerable about something that wasn't meaningful. Like, even as an admissions consultant, there's only so much we can do. It's about turning a story that's not really meaningful, make it sound meaningful. Like, it's just not going to work, is it?
Yeah, I think like that's kind of in keeping with our approach towards tell the authentic story, right? Like, it doesn't have to sound impressive. It doesn't have to, be it doesn't have to be something that is just going to knock their socks off if you say it. If it's not authentic to you, then ultimately it's not going to resonate, and it's not going to get you the results that you want.
Absolutely. Authenticity is everything, as we always say. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about HBS then. So a lot of people watching this are hoping for a little bit of insight into HBS and why it's so unique. So can you talk about your time there and maybe focus on what surprised you?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I remember, first of all, I loved my time there. I think I hyped it up. Everyone hypes it up in their mind that, it's got this such an illustrious reputation, but I found that it met every expectation. And that really comes down to the classmates, right? Like, the faculty is incredible, the facility is incredible. It's cool to walk around campus, but like, the real formative part of the experience is the class, and particularly the section, because the class is 1,000 people. You're not going to get a chance, unlike if you were to go to Haas or something like a smaller class school, you're not going to get a chance to meet everyone in the class and develop relationships with them. So you will get a chance to build deep relationships with the folks in your section. So that's about the 90 people that you're going to spend the entire first year with. And one of the things that surprised me was the impact of class composition, particularly US versus international, on the discussion. Coming from a military background and coming from the Pentagon, like, everyone that I interacted with on a professional and frankly a personal level were Americans, and skewing heavily male and skewing heavily white, right? And so when you're working in that environment, because you walk around the Pentagon, you're going to see a lot of white dudes from the US. When you're walking around HBS, and particularly when you're in class discussions, I mean, I think my class was 40% international students. And the dramatically positive effect that can have on broadening your perspective and thinking about things in a different way, and breaking those, sort of echo chambery type thought patterns that happen when you interact only with people that look like you and come from a similar background to you. Like, that was new to me. Even my undergrad was overwhelmingly homogenous in the demographics, and I didn't expect for that aspect of HBS to have quite such a profound impact on how I think about things, and I think it was really powerful.
Can I push back as a Saki Brit on this and say,
yeah,
Does that mean so 60% of the class are American?
Hmm.
You think compared to some of the international programs where no one country makes up more than maybe 10, 15%, do you think maybe if diversity of perspectives is what you're looking for, there are maybe other programs that are more suited?
Probably. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly you look at some of the particularly European business schools. And if what you are looking for is a diversity of perspective and a heterogeneous student body that are really going to be bringing to bear the best minds from everywhere in the world, having only 40% of the class be diverse from an international versus U.S. Aspect is probably a fair criticism. For me, more than 10% or 5% international was new. So maybe it's better for me that you didn't throw me in the deep end of the pool. And
I'm just it's a commentary that people often have about the US versus Europe business school comparison. Harvard is not unique in its business school profile being predominantly American.
yeah,
And so yeah, it's just an interesting comparison. Yeah, me
yeah.
being snarky Brit,
I mean,
those things.
it's interesting. You and I will have very different perspectives on this because, like, I came in and I said like 40% international. Absolutely incredible. Like that's so many, and you're like 40%. That means I have to hang out with 66 out of 10 other people I have to be in a room with are American.
Anyway, interesting. So tell us a little bit more about the program. So you're there for 2 years, and you said the people around you are really what made the program unique for you. What do you think? Yeah, you said they're very different, but what do you think they had in common? What do you think was that common trait that people at HBS had? In other words, what are people who are likely to get in demonstrating?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, and I talk about this quite a bit in particularly in like mock interviews and the guidance around mock interviews is how do you communicate yourself as someone who's going to fit in with the other folks in the class while also standing out from the other applicants? Well, that's a tough nut to crack. I think if I had to pick a common thread across my classmates, one is intellectual horsepower. They're all really, really smart, not surprisingly, intimidatingly so. And two, they all have this genuine intellectual curiosity, right? Like everyone has gone there with this common idea that I'm not just going to be learning from the professors. I'm intended to be learning from, or meant to be learning from my classmates as well. So that means I need to keep an open mind as to what my classmates can teach me. I don't know everything, and many folks, come from a professional environment where they might have been the big fish in the small pond or the top dog in their company and the hot running, quick riser or something like that. In whatever field that they come from. But now, they are one of many overachieving alpha people that have found their way at HBS or found their way to HBS. So I think
Was it competitive? So was it competitive? Because as you say, it's 1,000 people who are used to being the very best in their environment. Was it competitive?
I cannot answer that categorically. I can say for some people it's very competitive. So the thing that you sort of realize very quickly at HBS is grades don't matter. At no point since my time at HBS has anyone asked me, what was your GPA? You don't really have a GPA, right? Like your grades, as long as you're not failing, you're passing, and that's reflective in the grading system, the 1, 2, and 3. Those are the only grades you can get. It's somewhere around like, top 10% of the class gets a 1, middle, 70, 80% of the class gets a 2, and the rest of them get a 3. And if you get too many 3s, you can get in trouble, and 3s are bad and can land you on academic probation. But I can't think of anyone who got like kicked out of HBS for academic reasons. So some people take that to heart and say, this is my opportunity to dial down my competitiveness and to think about what I want to learn rather than what can get me a good grade or anything like that. Some people have that dog in them. That competitive, you cannot get the competitive spirit out of them. And I think that's reflective in the pursuit for the Baker Scholarship. So Baker Scholars are graduates from HBS who are in the top 5% of the class. It's a short list, and people who get Baker Scholar, they have a lot of very good marks. They have a lot of ones. They're in top 10% of the vast majority of the classes that they took at HBS, where there's lots of other smart people. And so, there's only 50 people that are Baker Scholars every year. And there are a lot of folks who come into HBS saying, I want to be a Baker Scholar. And so they are keeping that competitive drive very high. The next level down, beyond Baker Scholar, is graduating with distinction, which is the top 10% of your class.
With you, right?
Which I got. You know who walks around and touts their graduating with distinction? Nobody. So if you ain't first, you're last. I think I was like one away from being a Baker Scholar or something. And I remember calculating it and being really bummed that, like, if I had just been a little bit more competitive in financial reporting and control, the accounting class, or if I had just paid attention a little bit more in finance too, which is really hard, that I might have been a Baker Scholar. But ultimately, it's up to you. You don't have to be competitive. You certainly can if that's the thing that drives you.
Let's talk about other schools, or comparing Harvard to other schools. So I think that the most applicants that we work with who are applying to Harvard are also applying to Stanford and Wharton. That kind of that trio are a quite common applicant group. What's your perception of how people who do well at Harvard different from people who get into or succeed at Stanford and Wharton?
It's a good question. I think there's a lot of it's a challenging question to answer because there's a lot of overlap. I would say the first thing that I would say is it's a little bit of a crapshoot, right? Like, either if you have a compelling ability to get into Harvard or Stanford or Wharton, that does not mean you're going to get into all three. And both in my personal experience and in my consulting work, I've seen a lot of folks who got into Stanford, didn't even get an interview at Wharton, or got into Harvard and, got an interview, but didn't get into Tuck or something like that. So ultimately, there's a lot of idiosyncratic effect when it comes to the application process. But if I had to speak in generalities, I would say Harvard really likes like the folks that they feel can teach something to the other students, right? So being an expert, being someone who speaks up, being someone who's able to take a perspective, a little bit of a stronger personality, perhaps, that can be helpful, because your mandate when you're in these class discussions with the case-based method that Harvard's famous for, is that you take a perspective and you defend it. Wharton, I think, is a little bit more, if I could make a categorical statement, is a little bit more hard skill, like the finance background where you're going to go back into finance afterwards, or if you want to break into finance, right? Like, you have those hard skills, but you're also a social person that's well adjusted and is going to be a good leader. Then Wharton can resonate. I think Stanford tends to be really great at picking out folks that are strong interpersonal communicators and have excelled in a niche path that makes them truly impressive and truly stand out from the thousands and thousands of other applicants that they can choose from. So, Stanford GSB alums have gone on to build incredible companies and change the world in really meaningful ways. And so, alums of the other two, but they're really good at picking out those and shaping those folks that are going to be both great on a one-on-one level, but also make a really strong impact as alums.
Yeah. The quote that I heard is Harvard's strong at creating leaders that scale. Stanford's strong at creating one-on-one leaders, and I think that sort of boils it down in a way, doesn't it, to sort of quite a a simple statement, and obviously far too simple, but it gives you an idea. Okay, really interesting. So let's talk about HBS interview. So HBS's interview, as we know, is quite unique. It's quite intense. You obviously went through the process and nailed this. Tell us your perspective on the HBS interview.
Well, I hope I nailed it. It's a blur.
Okay.
I think it's interesting. So the goal of the admissions committee is to make the interview feel like a conversation. It's an intense conversation, but the reason that they structure it such that there's an interviewer that's from the admissions committee, and there's a scribe who's off to the side who's taking notes, and the interviewer is just firing questions at you and asking you follow-up questions, means that it feels a lot more like a conversation than a staccato sort of back and forth interview. If you walk out of it 35 minutes later, feeling like, okay, that was just a great conversation, it doesn't really feel like I got grilled, then that's a good sign. I do think that it's tough to prepare for because of how many different directions they can take the conversation. These types of stock questions that you'll see on any number of websites that have here are all the questions for the HBS interview. Tell me about a time when you experienced adversity. Guess what? It ain't going to be that easy. Like they want to break the pattern or the tendency of applicants to prepare, a canned response to everything. And it's because you don't really get a fulsome understanding of who someone is as a person, which is the goal of the interview. If you just ask them the standard questions that they've prepared for, it's almost like a song and dance if you're going to do that. And so what they'll try to do, in my experience, both personally and as an admissions consultant, is they'll try to zoom in on some aspect of your professional experience or personal experience, or something you said in your essay, or something you said in your, short-term and long-term goals, and say, tell me more about this, right? Like, you left this job and you went to this job. That was a pretty big change. Tell me about why you made that change, right? And so they're looking to fill in an understanding of the gaps or the connections and linkages between your experiences, and then go deeper, right? Like, okay, so you told me about this job. What did you do here? What was your impact? Did you have any issues with building rapport with the team? Did you have any challenges with your boss, right? Like, they really want to go deep. And then when you give an answer, you kind of need to be prepared to talk even more about it, because very often the line of reasoning will be, they'll ask you about something and then you'll give an answer, and then they'll deep dive into something you said in your answer as like the next line of questioning. So it's certainly not that they have a list of questions, and once you finish a question, they're going to go to the next one. They have the experience and the structure to sort of make it a free-flowing discussion, with the intent of really understanding, one, what motivates you, two, how do you think, right? Like, if you made a deliberate change in your career, how structured of a decision was that? What were the criteria that you were using to evaluate whether that was a good idea or a bad idea? And ultimately, how well are you how good of a job do you do at communicating? How good of a communicator are you? Because so much of the HBS experience relies on you communicating your perspective to other students in the classroom. So that's they mirror that the interview structure to how they expect the classroom discussion to go.
Nice.
So that's very unique.
Super interesting. Really, really interesting. Let's pivot a little bit. So one of the key, you mentioned earlier on in your introduction that you're a military applicant, and you also mentioned that Harvard has a regular contingent. Every year there's a contingent of military applicants. Tell us about that. So what proportion roughly of the class is military applicants?
Yeah, so it's about 5%. So 5% military applicants and 5% of the class are military. So you're competing against, your odds are tough, but you're competing against typically a smaller smaller group of other applicants. You have to beat out. You're kind of like, in my opinion, you're compared against the other military applicants, and that's a much smaller group than being someone in banking who's getting compared against everyone else in finance. That's a much larger group that you have to compete against. So it ends up being about 5% per year of the HBS class, or about 50 veterans per class.
Okay. And so tell me what a strong veteran profile looks like. How do the school distinguish between veterans?
Yeah, I think it's tough because veterans experience is very different. There will always be a contingent of special operators, SEALs, Delta Force, the Army Rangers, and these guys that are super badass. To be honest, I was in the military, and I still think they're super badass. So the SEALs and the special operators make up, I would say, maybe a quarter or a bit less of the veterans. So if you're not one of those, you're not going to compete against those guys. And what's different is there's kind of the SEALs or the special operators where like they can just stand on their job and be like, this is what I did. I was in, I served three tours in Afghanistan and killed bad guys and did this awesome, incredible stuff to serve my country. Like they don't really, if they have a good test score, they have good, that many of them went to the military academies. Like they don't really need that much more. Like what more do you really want from someone? They've already done so much. In contrast, there's like people like me, the other like 75% or 80%, where it's like, cool, you are a Navy officer. That's great. What else did you do, right? What did you do while you were in the Navy that was impressive? What did you do outside of the Navy that rounded out your profile? I mean, for me, I was had started a small artisan woodworking shop where I was building dining room tables and classic craftsman furniture with Japanese joinery on the side in the co-working makerspace across the street from the Pentagon. And like I did it not to get into an MBA, but because I just thought it was really cool. But I think like having an interesting job where you've excelled, right? Like your evaluations have to be very, very good. Your recommendations have to be very impressive. And many veterans will pick their, general or admiral or colonel or whoever impressive sounding boss that they have. It's really important that person know you well and know how to be able to genuinely speak to your performance and how it's distinct from other junior officers that or enlisted that they might have seen. But really, like, if you're not a SEAL, if you're not a special operator, it's not enough that you were a Navy officer or an Army officer or Air Force or something that did pretty well. You need to do really well, and you need to have stuff outside of the military that fill in, the rest of your application package.
You raise a good point there. So if you're not on the SEAL special operator side, you're in that sort of 75% that you talk about of military applicants. What's a competitive GMAT or GRE score?
I mean, it depends on the school. We're just talking about HBS, but I think the way I talk about GMAT and GRE is it can't get you in, but it can keep you out, right? So if you have a less than, let's say, 700, 710 or something like that, GMAT less than 327, 325, something like that, GRE, it's if you have above that, let's take the positive angle. If you have above that, it's pretty good likelihood that your application is going to get looked at, right? Like anything below that, and there are probably enough other military applicants with good test scores that you might get a short look, and then it's just tougher to come back from. It's tougher to break through from that. So do as well as you possibly can on the test, and that's going to set you up for success to ensure that the rest of your application is read thoroughly.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay, now the other thing I want to talk about is you, after your MBA, you did a brief stint in management consulting at McKinsey. Yeah. So you've also got a bit of an insight into consultants and how consultants are both people pivoting into consulting like you did, and people who are going from consulting into the MBA. So tell us about consultant profile. A lot of consultants applying for MBAs. How do they stand out?
I think it's tough. It's really tough. And it's because, if you ask, separate from the entire MBA application process, if you ask a consultant what they do, like I hope you have enough time on your hands to deal with the answer. Like it depends, I do a lot of things, synergies, and there's all these like buzzwords around like what you actually do. And it's because it's really hard. It's really hard to communicate when, many consultants take the random walk, which is, I went into McKinsey without a real idea of what industry or function I wanted to specialize in. And so I took a random walk, right? Like I did one study in mining and figured out I really don't want to do mining again. And I figured out that, I did one study in aerospace and defense and thought that was interesting, but didn't really like being a supply chain guy. So I went to this, right? So it can be really hard to articulate this common thread, right? So that what you want to do, in my opinion, to stand out as a consultant is not necessarily to dive into any one engagement, but to show that you have approached your experience in a structured way, right? Like even it's okay if you went on a random walk and didn't have a thesis going in, but you should have some way of like deducing, hey, I knew that there were these 4 areas or industries that I was not at all interested. I was not interested in pharma. I was not interested in healthcare. I was not interested in oil and gas, right? So I knocked those off. And then I came up with this short list and I did a study in each of these. And I figured out, okay, I don't like these 2, right? So what I'm walking you through is like a structured approach towards my experience in consulting. And I think that reveals, when you spit that out, that reveals an illustration of how you think, right? And you want to think in a structured way. So it can be hard to stand out as a consultant. You need to have delivered impact in a way that you can explain concisely, which can be hard, right? And you need to be able to show that you have taken a deliberate approach in your consulting experience, which also can be hard. And ultimately, it's really helpful if you also have things outside of consulting that round out your profile. Now, as a recovering consultant, I can say that when you're working 90 hours a week in a due diligence, it doesn't really leave that much time for, working in a soup kitchen. So that can be really practically challenging with the demands of consulting's lifestyle. But if you can at all do that, that's ideal. I also think, like, just speaking candidly, like not all consulting is equal, and there is a pecking order of consulting firms, right? Like if just being a management consultant, like if you did if you worked for a firm that wasn't particularly competitive to get into out of undergrad, and you didn't do particularly interesting work that didn't have a very high impact, then that is not going to be seen the same as working for an MBB consulting firm and having huge impact. And because the implicit understanding is, boy, if you can get into McKinsey, Bain, or BCG, like you've clearly got a good head on your shoulders. Now, of course, there are lots of other firms that are very selective and deliver just as good, if not better, impact in certain areas. But it's good to have a good brand on your resume, is a long story short.
Sure. I'm going to chime in on this one. So we worked with quite a few McKinsey applicants in round 1. And so amalgamating some insights from those, I'd like to point to, there's a couple of things that I found stood out from so 2 McKinsey applicants got through to the interview stages, and we're in the process right now doing those mock interviews. And a couple of things that really stood out that differentiated them from their peers at McKinsey one of them was the brand of their undergrad. So if you've already got McKinsey on your resume, by definition, you're smart. You've got this outstanding brand on your resume. Like, how do you go beyond? How do they distinguish between McKinsey people? So, brand of undergrad is one of the key factors that has distinguished, in our experience, people that have got through to the HBS interview versus those that haven't. The other thing is that while the GMAT is considered a nice to have, or it can keep you out, but it can't get you in. For the military applicants, as you were saying, they are clearly using the consultants to bump up the class average GMAT. So as a consultant, I would argue your GMAT, GRE expectations are quite a few points higher than, for example, the military applicants that we spoke about before. And then the other point I'd like to highlight that is because differentiated applicants that have been successful, differentiated McKinsey applicants that have been successful at this stage, is the vulnerability of their essays. So you touched on this earlier, how the vulnerability of your essays when you're applying. I think it's very easy when you're in that 90 hours a week doing due diligence mindset to just get sort of sucked into the work and not step back and think about what is actually driving you. Where does that passion come from? And ultimately showing vulnerability. It's not something that in some realms is encouraged. Consulting, perhaps vulnerability, I would argue, is not something that's particularly valued. I was an investment banker before this, and vulnerability, quite the opposite. Vulnerability in investment banking is squashed, right? Hide that, don't show that to the client. So that ability to come across as vulnerable, I think, is another factor that's clearly distinguishing our clients that are successful in the HBS application process. So just a little sort of distraction there from me. Let's come back to your work applying to HBS with clients that we're working with. So you've clearly refined your application process. You've been through this enough times now, both with your own application and with client applications, to have developed a bit of a system for applying. Can you walk us through how it looks to work with Zack Hoyt, the admissions consultant?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just trying to piece everything together. I think the first and foremost bumper sticker is one-on-one video interview, very personal, right? Like developing a personal connection is not only more enjoyable for working with someone that you're hiring to help you get into the MBA program that you want to. It's also far more effective. And I think that's because when we spend time getting to know our clients, it allows us to make logical connections from other parts of your background, other parts of your personal experience in a way that you might not think about, right? Like I only think about my own personal experience as I experienced it, like linearly backwards, right? Like, but when someone else comes and looks at it from the side and says like, oh, well, you know what, actually, it seems like we could put these two stories together in a way that is really compelling as a narrative. Well, that's really, really helpful. And that's why I really like to work with the all-inclusive clients where we're going to spend a lot of meaningful time one-on-one over Zoom collaboratively before we even get into spelling and grammar of an essay. First we're going to look at the application strategy, right? Like what is it? What are the schools on your list? What is your profile? Do those two things match up, right? Then really spending a lot of time, probably my favorite part of the entire process is this SCAR analysis, right? So let's go into all of the salient, powerful stories of your personal and professional background and structure them in a way that is easily communicable in an interview or in an essay. So SCAR framework being situation, what's the context, what was going on, challenge, what challenge were you faced with, action, what action did you take, and result, what happened as a result of your actions. So when we spend time one-on-one over Zoom in a Google Doc together, really mashing out these stories before we've even looked at, the application, it's really helpful because it creates a repository that we can use in many different ways later on, both essays and interviews. We also want to articulate your post-MBA goals, both short-term and long-term. And we want to draw that sort of golden thread, as I call it, between what you've done in the past, what you want to do in the future, and why insert school name here is the place for you to be able to unlock that version of the future that you envision for yourself, and ensure that makes sense and is consistent with the rest of your narrative. Then and only then, after we have this big compendium of stories and a deep understanding of who you are as a candidate, do we map those stories to the essay prompts in the schools that you're applying to. So we'll talk about overall structure. Talk about what should the narrative of this essay be. Many of them are very open-ended. What more would you like us to know about you as a person? Well, shit, what do you want to know, right? Like it's very challenging question to answer.
Yeah.
I appreciate how intimidating being asked such an open-ended question like that can be. And so we work through that together and figure out, okay, what's the story that we want to tell? Go through this iterative process of editing that story for structure and content, and then, spelling and grammar, and then the one that nobody pays enough attention to, which is how do I make it within the word count limits, which is always tough because you have these beautiful sentences that you've crafted that have to be left on the cutting room floor. We want to make sure that your resume is up to snuff and in the format that the schools that you're applying to want to see. Letters of recommendation is an area that I don't think people spend enough time on, and to the extent that you can have some sort of influence into the creative process of your interviewers, either giving them a reminder sheet of a couple bullet points of, hey, here's some of the accomplishments that are contributions that I had to the organization while you were my boss, or just to jog their memory. That, to the extent that you can make the recommendation less of a question mark variable, the better off you'll be. And then once the application is done and submitted, we sort of shift to interview preparation. So giving mock interviews in as realistic of a setting as possible with a number of different consultants on our team, I think is a huge asset, because if I were to interview you 4 times, you'd give a great interview on the last one because you're so dang comfortable with me as a person, because we've talked for hours and hours and hours. And that's not realistic. You're going to walk into a room with someone that you've never met before and have your palms sweating and be terrified that your breath stinks or something like that. Like that's how it goes. So I think recreating that environment and drilling in that way is really helpful. And then lastly is the post-application support. So if we find ourselves in the ideal position where you've gotten acceptance to multiple schools, really helping through
scholarships.
Yes, and scholarships. Yeah. So figuring out okay, based on the financial aid options that you have available, scholarships that you might have available, and the goals, what you're really solving for, where should you go? We help our clients through that as well. And I think that's sort of the soup to nuts, very comprehensive approach that you don't get, and certainly don't get in such a collaborative way when you go with other consulting firms, in my experience.
So
I'm biased. I'm a family consultant.
Sure, easy. Just to dig into that then. So when for those of you that are watching that aren't familiar with this, so when you are working with an all-inclusive package with myself or with Zack or any other consultants on our team, when you get through to the interview stage, you will be interviewing. Typically, you would do your first interview with your lead consultant. So Zack does his first interview with clients just to really get the high level stuff right? Make sure that your narrative's right, make sure that you're generally covering the right material, but then very, very quickly pivot to interview with the other consultants in the team, systematically one after the other, who you've not met face to face. And as Zack says, you get that fresh face interview experience with somebody who has interviewed MBA applicants themselves. For example, we have on the team John Cheng, who was an MBA admissions evaluator at Berkeley Haas. We have Alex Zarganis, who did interviews for Columbia. So we have that team of people who are going to grill you and really put you through your paces, so that when it comes to doing the actual interview, you're going to absolutely crush it. Awesome. So Zack, thank you very, very much for joining us. Really, really insightful today. Seriously. And I learned a lot as well. It's really, really nice to hear from you. If somebody wants to get hold of you and potentially work together, how do they do so?
You can email me at zh@samweeks.com. That is the easiest way to do it. You can also find me on our website, samweeks.com, and look forward to hearing from you.
Perfect. So I'll add the email in the link to the video as well, to the bottom of the blog post. So thank you very much for watching. Really, really, hopefully you learned a lot out of today and got a lot out of today, and look forward to hearing from you. Zack, can I get a high five? So cheers. Thanks, Sam. Time. Take care, sir.
Yeah, you too.